huge thank you to CIBC for making We Get It possible.
All right, folks, welcome everyone to, believe it or not, already episode 10 of season 3 of We Get It, starring yourself, or myself, I should say, Alex Mandarino, and a distinguished guest today who I will introduce in a moment. So if you are listening today, it is Tuesday, April 19th at should be 7 p.m. Eastern if you're jumping on right away. But feel free to jump in, kind of learn a little bit about this episode and dive into this guest whenever you have the ability to do so. This gentleman is someone who I've known for a couple of years now, introduced through the Local Life Toronto program with Young Adult Cancer Canada, and very unique, very humble, someone who has a great story and someone who I can tell is quite passionate with what he does, but just to kind of learn a little bit about other people, which is why I wanted to bring him on. And we have Gerald Mak on with me today. Gerald, I'll kind of just let you take the reins and introduce you with a question that I normally introduce everyone with, which is, what would be 3 words you would use to describe yourself?
Hello, Alex, and hello, everyone who's joining us this evening. My name's Gerald. For 3 words to describe myself, I probably would say I am someone who's engaged, dedicated, and ethical. I see a lot of things black and white, and maybe that's a little too strong, but yeah, those would be the 3 words that would be for me. And thank you again, Alex, for having me this evening.
You're most welcome. No, I'm glad we can make this work. And I think those are 3 words that, even though we haven't known each other for a crazy long amount of time, I think those are fairly accurate from a bystander standpoint. So awesome stuff. But for those who might not know you, whether they're outside of the GTA area and haven't met you at a local life event or something of that nature, can you tell us a little bit about your sort of just generic cancer story, maybe from diagnosis to kind of where you are at with life right now?
Yeah, absolutely. Believe it or not, I was actually in my undergrad, where I was actually in my final year of university, where I had received a cancer diagnosis. I was actually on a conference in Vancouver where I was not feeling so well. And I was on a flight back to Toronto. And by the time I got to Toronto, literally the next day I had collapsed. And it was from that experience where we essentially found out through a ruptured appendix, where I found out that I had, cancer through that crazy event. And from there, literally, I took a semester off. It was crazy because no one in my family had any sort of cancer history. Thankfully, after treatment with the folks at Princess Margaret Cancer Center, I ended up am now currently in remission. And occasionally, when I look back of how that entire journey was, we certainly didn't have the resources we do today when it comes to, resources like great folks like YACC, the Zoom, all of the movies and all that stuff. Back then, things were so limited. Believe it or not, like the Wi-Fi in the hospital system back then would not let you go on Netflix or Prime Video. It was a very different time, I have to say, compared to where we are today. So, yeah.
Couldn't agree more. And although we kind of didn't touch on this question-wise beforehand, you introduced the fact that you were kind of in your 3rd year of university. And I know I was in a very similar sort of time frame right at the end of the first semester. So having to take a semester off for obviously, kind of recouping your body and mind, what was that like? Was it, because for me, it was the first thing front of mind was, I don't want to take time off school. Were you more focused on your health at that point? Was school kind of a big deal? How did that kind of sit with you, having to take a semester off?
You brought a great question, Alex. And it's so funny because I actually had the same thing as you. I was just so eager to get back on campus. I had emailed my program director at the time. I was literally pleading with them, asking if I could take at least 1 or 2 courses or whatever. My course director at that time, my program director, excuse me, was such a phenomenal person. She actually came to visit me at Princess Margaret and literally sat down with me and said to me, you shouldn't really be coming back right now. And you should be focusing on your studies. And from there, focusing on your recovery. And from there, I really took her advice because she gave me a few stories where some of her friends and so forth had gone through similar experiences, but really the mind should be, on recovery. So like you, Alex, I was very eager to get back to class, but essentially taking that semester off was actually the best choice for me, because I didn't realize how I'm sure many of us would say the same, how aggressive chemotherapy is for folks, especially how draining and tiring it is. But I also wanted to say that, the long-term effects, I think, for a lot of people, when we as young adults don't realize how hard it was to get back to routine, to get back to, your part-time job or your full-time job. It's one of the toughest things where I think a lot of young people who have gone through cancer is often challenged, is whether or not to take on that same workload, course load, to get back into routine. And I have to be honest with you, it was not easy going back. And I think for a lot of young people, we have to take it easy. But the biggest concern, I think, on a lot of people's mind going back, who are finished, for those who are finished post-secondary or schooling, is where does the income come from afterwards? Living in a city like Toronto that is so expensive. I recall a lot of young people who were in Princess Margaret were just wondering, my goodness, like, you can go through those different programs, the government assistance and so forth, but it is definitely not enough. And that conversation with your employer is such a tough one. So I am so glad that we have programs like YACC. Sorry, running on a little tangent here, but I think I have to say the support network for YACC is phenomenal, because you're not going to find a group like this where you can actually pick up the phone, talk to someone who's gone through something similar, and hear some advice from others to guide you through that. So yeah, definitely. Yeah.
There's a lot that you kind of bring up there, right? It's like there's so many balls in the air that you're juggling, especially as a young adult. And I think a lot of what you talked about regarding obviously recovery, to go back to school and then enter the workforce, can even be sort of translated to someone early or even midway or late in their career, that you have to take that time, and then even if you're used to your workload at work, how do you kind of transition back into the workforce when you've already taken that step back? So I mean, with all of those issues being brought up, and especially in a new environment and going through the hospital and kind of all of that treatment, when did you kind of first realize that maybe you needed some form of support from the cancer community, whether it be financial, social? Like, when was that first kind of realization?
Yeah, no, thank you. Great question, because the first thing I literally realized was, oh my gosh, I don't know anybody in my network who has gone through a similar experience.
Yeah.
So at the very first time, I had literally searched all over online when I was in treatment, and I was like, I couldn't even find anybody within my Facebook network. And the first thing I saw was back then when YACC, I think, was more popular in the West and East Coast than in the city at the time. And when I came across that, I realized I couldn't really go at the time because of my state. But afterwards, right after I had started to go back into classes very slowly, gradually, once I was given the a year mark, I started applying for the YACC retreats, because I still couldn't find people within my network to share those discussions with cancer. And I think once I had gotten to the strength that I could go on a trip, on a retreat, that was when I realized, like, wow, YACC was really the only group out there at that time and within Canada that I could really start to see. So I ended up doing 2 YACC retreats. I'm sure, I hope I got that correctly, but I'm pretty sure I did 2 retreats. And I think from there, it was a phenomenal experience, because you actually got to sit around, and people who are familiar with YACC would know this very well, is you really get that chance to sit with other folks who've been through other similar experiences. And I think that was what I was really looking for, was hearing that from other people, not necessarily getting that off my chest on things I didn't get to talk about with folks. But when you are in treatment as a young person, especially in a very metropolitan area like Toronto, most of the patients on the floor are in their 80s and 70s. At that time, we didn't even have the AYA program at Princess Margaret Cancer Center. Yeah. It was literally the nurses in the hospital that would look for another young person on the ward and try to put you two in the same room together, because that was what they could do at best to help you socialize. And you would always get these looks on the floor. people looking at you, going like, oh my gosh, that person is so young. And when you go through all of that experience in the hospital, you often wonder, geez, who can I really talk to? How will the social worker really understand what I'm going through? Because, I'm under 30 and below, nobody would really understand. So YACC, I think, was there at the right time, Alex, when it came to, right after treatment, because you don't get a group like that. So that was when I realized that I needed that sort of support, because I ended up, keeping it to myself for the time during treatment. And then when I realized that it was the right time, it was YACC was definitely there for support. So
yeah, that's an awesome story. And like the point being that it's kind of, you're in this, the lack of a better term, like sweet spot, but it's not sweet because you're just above the sort of sick kids age range,
yeah,
but you're below the the general age range where you don't expect to receive a cancer diagnosis, but in the older age range it becomes a little bit more prominent. So that middle ground where we're at, there's not a lot of those resources, or even individuals within, whether it's Princess Margaret Hospital or really anywhere else in the country, where you can have that collaboration and conversation with people our age. And obviously you touch on that first retreat. Was that the one out west that you had been to, you suggested?
Yeah, we were very fortunate to head over out west somewhere in Alberta, in a very beautiful area, and another one I think was Grossmore,
Yes.
out east. But my goodness, it was exhausting when it came to climbing and all of that. But that's the whole point of the retreats, as you would know very well, Alex, is to challenge each other, but at the same time sharing those very intimate discussions with each other. So yeah, it was fantastic. I have to say, YACC has really stepped up to helping for those who may not financially be available to attend those through various fundraising initiatives. So great program helping young people. So
Yeah. And so one event we haven't talked about, or one program I guess we haven't talked about, was Local Life, where you and I sort of had gotten acquainted and kind of built this friendship from. So obviously you've been to a few, whether they be virtual or in person, through the Local Life channel, where Kayla and I kind of lead that activity and program. What events so far with Local Life have you felt has been your favorite thus far?
I have to say they all have been phenomenal. The Local Life leaders who have stepped up to the plate to volunteer as a Local Life leader over the last couple of years have been phenomenal. We've seen events from the Christmas market to in the distillery district, to Kayla's backyard, where a pool party, to from back in the day where we had virtual games nights when the pandemic broke out. And all events have always been phenomenal, because there are new people that come. There's also returning familiar faces. But believe it or not, sometimes you see people who you never knew that you came like cross paths at the hospital, but you never knew who they were, and you end up seeing them here at Local Life. Is actually very touching. So I have to say all of them have been fantastic by far. They're very well planned. Thank you, Alex and Kayla. People are very well fed. So again, thank you to all the Local Life leaders for taking care of that. But they've been all fantastic. And I think any young person who has gone through similar experiences should definitely, if they don't get a chance to go to the retreat, definitely check out those Local Life events, because no, they're great. So thank you for
Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Anytime. I did not pay you to say that as well, just so everyone's aware. In terms of the food aspect, that will never be scarcity in terms of food when you're working with us. But yeah, I know we've always had a blast, and it's always the people that show up are the ones that actually make the event what it is. But it's true, you always kind of connect with individuals where you may have not spoken to the person in a few years, you haven't seen them, maybe they've been off kind of engaging in other capacities. But it's funny that you mentioned the ability to maybe see someone who you've seen in the hospital or you've come across in other faculties, and you realize, oh well, this is they've gone through something similar, and it's nice to have crossed paths now in some way. So
really quickly, Alex, don't mean to digress, but
get in there.
There was one time I recall I was looking at the 16th floor atrium and just looking down at some of the other floors in the building, and the amount of young people that I saw, even though we never got a chance to talk to each other but seeing like the sadness from the different young people that were there because they just didn't have an avenue to connect with each other was, and back then, as you know today, patient confidentiality, the staff cannot really introduce you to another patient in the hospital. They can only have these, discussion groups where you volunteer yourself. Back then, I had to host game nights myself at the hospital where I would invite, 10, 15 friends of mine to come out once a week, every other week at the hospital just to host events to see friends and so forth. So local life events have been a tremendous help for young people, whether they're in treatment or not in treatment or after treatment. It's just fantastic. So
no, that's a great anecdote there too. I remember at Princess Margaret myself a few years back. I don't remember the year, maybe it was 2018, probably earlier than that, where right at the end of my like kind of treatment as an outpatient and more so in the maintenance phase, there was a conversation in a group where I think it was an 8-week program with AYAs based in mindfulness and meditation. So the first class was fairly packed and it dwindled a little bit as the weeks went on. I think maybe people either weren't mentally ready or physically ready. Maybe some of it didn't appeal to them. But the fact is, I think when it started, there was about 30 to 35 people in the group. And I was like, I didn't even know half of these people were in the hospital, in any capacity. So even though it may not have worked out where everyone stuck around for those 8 weeks, like I had made it through all 8 and it was very grateful for it. But it does, like, I think even just those small group gatherings makes it at least
huge.
If you don't stick around, it's huge because you realize like there are people like me who are going through this. So I think it makes a big difference.
Last comment. Sorry for
please.
No, for sure. Like to your point, Alex, I used to recall like a few other organizations in the city. The biggest challenge was for being able to make those, especially when you're immunocompromised and trying to get from point A to point B. So very grateful for these events because the discussions that take place for people to share and get things off their chest is tough. And I'm very fortunate to hear YACC and a few other groups have continued that today. It's just great. So
big time. And just kind of switching topics a little away from YACC to sort of a different organization and a different, not cause by any means, but different fundraising initiative, which is the Princess Margaret Ride to Conquer Cancer, which happens mostly every year. I know the past few years have been a bit off, but when did you first hear about this event? I know you're very prominent in this space, but when was the first time you kind of heard about the event and decided to dive deep into it?
The Ride to Conquer Cancer, I could not believe, is in its 15th year this year. And the event is, some of the years in the past, they've raised over $20 million. It's phenomenal in that one event. For those who are not familiar, it's a 2-day bike ride from Toronto, starting off at Ontario Place, goes to McMaster University, where you will spend one night at McMaster. And then the second day is from McMaster to Niagara Falls towards the huge, beautiful scenery of the falls. So it's a 2-day event where you have to fundraise $2,500 over the course of 2 days. It's phenomenal. Every 25 kilometers, there's a snack station. There's about 5,000 cyclists that typically take part in this phenomenal event. I started probably 2013, give it or take, was when I first heard of it. And ever since, I've always enjoyed participating in the event because what's so touching about the event is you actually get to see other cancer survivors participating in this event all the time. So some cancer survivors who choose to identify, they will wear have a yellow flag on their bike. And what's so touching is that when you do that bike ride, out of the 5,000 people, I remember seeing at least over 100 people with those yellow flags to say, I had treatment at Princess Margaret Cancer Center. I've had treatment at, Sunnybrook, what have you, to come back as former patients coming back to support the hospital that they received treatment from. So I first heard about it in 2013. And this year I'm doing the event again, and I started a team. A lot of workplaces, believe it or not, Alex, actually have cycling teams for these
Yeah.
events. So I ended up starting a team at my work. We have about 7 riders participating this year because everybody has been impacted. So what better way to give back than to go on a bike to 2 days from Toronto to Niagara Falls. So
Oh, yeah. The fundraising, you get a little exercise in there as well. So you kind of kill 2 birds with 1 stone in that realm. You already kind of touched on it, but just for curiosity's sake, there obviously is so many different fundraising initiatives countrywide, nationwide. Obviously there's an affinity for you for the Princess Margaret, like the Ride to Conquer Cancer, but is there any specific reason that maybe you haven't touched on yet that makes you come back every year and continuously fundraise? Like, is there one aspect or is there multiple that makes this one more special for you?
yeah, believe it or not, I didn't even know how to ride a bike when I first signed up for this for the first time, and I actually taught myself how to ride a bike
That's awesome.
in my 20s, believe it or not. Like I grew up in downtown Toronto, and
Yeah.
you would imagine I picked that up a bit sooner. But for this particular event, I have to say what kept me coming back was the age demographics in this particular event ranges from young people all the way to people in their 70s, and seeing people, with amputees that are participating to seniors who are in treatment still. I recall one year where we had a rider who was in his stage 4, but he still wanted to do the ride before he became, he was no longer with us. But I was just surprised by the enthusiasm from the riders from across the province, and hearing how this Ride to Conquer Cancer event is actually held by a number of cancer centers across the world, including folks in the States, including in British Columbia. So it's almost like a uniform cycling event that takes place across many cancer centers. So I think that was what compelled me to keep coming back, was the hospital that I had, the treatment that I benefited from. But yeah, it's and of course you and I are both McMaster alumni. So coming to see that campus all the time coming back is also another reason as well. So
I know. Yeah. And
great.
you'd mentioned, oh yeah, great. You had mentioned this year too, that the ability to stay at Mac is that still available? I can't remember if
Still available. So
nice.
for
Awesome.
those who haven't done this before, the ride, they set up over 100 tents at the stadium at McMaster, and they have like free food, free massages, all of that stuff, like live entertainment, all at McMaster. For those, and McMaster is a great participant as well. Every year they give a really great rate for people who want to stay there overnight as well. So yeah.
Good to know. Good to know. Absolutely. So I'm actually, interestingly enough, the next question kind of transitions to a lot of your volunteer kind of avenues. When we talked a little last week, more in a casual sense, I was aware of a lot of the work that you had done, but not, for the most part, more comprehensively. And to kind of transition, perfect, we talked about Mac. I had even noticed on LinkedIn, Gerald, that you had, I'm just going to pull this up, recognized with the Ontario Medal for Good Citizenship for both 2019 and 2020 with McMaster. So obviously, congratulations on that. That's an incredible accomplishment. But, what kind of motivates you? Because you sit on a lot of different boards, you do a lot of volunteer and charity work, in many different capacities. Is there like a motivation for all of that? Has it always been the way that you've kind of been, or like kind of just talk to me a little bit about that, if you don't mind?
Yeah, I actually, funny enough, I started volunteering when I was about probably maybe 12 to 14 years old. I started volunteering with a number of different organizations back then in high school, because the high school where I went to in Toronto, it's called Earl Haig Secondary School. We had over 100 extracurriculars in the high school. We had at that time 2,400 students. Now it's 2,600 students. So you could imagine how large of a high school that was. So we had a large number of extracurriculars. So from high school, even at a young age, I started volunteering with the school board, the City of Toronto, the Toronto Police Service, and I kept on volunteering because growing up in downtown Toronto, I had a lot of my friends who came from single parented households. And a number of my friends were also living in lower income neighborhoods. So they were living in community housing, rental properties, paycheck to paycheck. It was tough. I was very fortunate that I saw a lot of that at an early age because most people, you grow up in areas, but you don't see some of the hard stuff. And I think the school that I went to when I grew up in downtown Toronto, I saw a lot of hardships. I saw, one of my friends at the time during Father's Day, he would cry every year because, he came from a single parented home. And I've seen other young people who were in juvenile back then for beating up people, stabbings, and all of that, and other people that I grew up with who ended up with gangs, and some of their friends lost their life at an early age due to violence. You would never believe these sort of stories in Toronto. And so many more stories to share, but I ended up, from all of those experiences, I ended up realizing that it's so important to give back to the community because of the fact that when you see stories like this, when you know people who are who've been impacted by crime, all of that stuff, you have to give back. So I started volunteering with St. John Ambulance, Toronto Police Service, all of those different organizations because they have such a strong impact to the community. And there's a motto that I always use, and it's community service is the rent that we pay for living. So today, over the last 15 plus years that I've been volunteering, Big Brothers Big Sisters, Children's Aid Society of Toronto, mentorship in the different universities. Occasionally, folks at Princess Margaret Hospital, they're looking for cancer survivors to help with their research studies, develop the research studies, and I also volunteer my time doing that as well. All those years I kept on doing that, Alex, because it helps pay it forward. So when you help other people who benefit from that will essentially do a bit better in their lives, and they know that once they are in a position to do so, they too will give back. So that cycle, the perpetual cycle of paying it forward, is something that I envy very much. So that's what inspires me to motivate myself to keep volunteering or fundraising or what have you. So yeah.
It's a great answer. I appreciate you sharing that. And I mean, I think what it tells too is that obviously, to kind of bring it back to where we're at, there's a lot of different ways that you can give back in any community. And I think the reason I really ask is to determine, is that something that you've kind of had innate in you your whole life, or if cancer has made a difference? But it seems like that's just kind of been the way that you've gone about your life based on your environment, which is an incredible story to hear. And I think what also just teaches is that there's so many different ways that, whether you already see this in your life as a young, individual, or whether as a young adult you go through some sort of traumatic experience, I think it makes you realize that there's this ability to give back in any capacity. And, a lot of people go through different circumstances that define them as people. And, whether that is cancer or whether that's kind of the environment that you're put in when you're growing up, I think it gives you this, eye-opening experience to determine maybe, there's some capacity that I can either get involved in something or give back or fundraise. And I think it's a great motivational story, to be honest with you.
No, absolutely. And I'm also glad to see you as well, Alex, volunteering, giving back through YACC. And there, I have to be honest, there are not a lot of organizations out there that support young adults with cancer. And because of all of the privacies and all of that stuff, it's very hard for volunteers, especially former cancer survivors, to come back and help, because a lot of that mostly is related to research or one or two organizations that have that sort of front to do so. So I have to say, it's so great to see volunteers who volunteer for YACC, because they make the events possible. And for those who do fundraise for cancer CCS or, Princess Margaret. It's so great to see those people fundraise because it seems those are the only two avenues that I've seen over the last couple of years. But it's so good to give back. And thank you too as well, Alex, for you and Kayla and the former YACC leaders who've been constantly planning events in the city because there's no real other group that have these sort of events. So thank you for that. So yeah.
You got it. Absolutely. Awesome. I appreciate it. So again, more transitioning away from that, although hard to transition from such a great topic about, the volunteering and all the work that you do. One thing I've noticed about you is you're kind of a big fan of capturing the moment. Now, whether it's like a big kind of thing like, the Ride to Conquer Cancer and obviously filming or taking pictures of that, or whether it's just like a general social event, going out for dinner or grabbing a drink here and there. You're great at kind of just taking pictures, sharing them either on social media or with others in your group. Has this always kind of been your mindset? Has it been changed at all in any way? Or is it kind of just, you might as well live in the moment and then try and capture it? Like, how is that coming about for you?
Yeah, no, great observation, Alex.
Yeah.
Funny enough, I think back in the day during chemotherapy, I certainly noticed a bit of brain fog, and I know a lot of people have gone through very similar instances. And I think from that experience through the various times during chemo with brain fog, I realized what was best for me was just to take photos so at least I could recall and be, oh yeah, there was a moment like that, or thinking back and looking back, such and such has happened. So ever since the experience of going through brain fog, I've certainly what I do today is I usually, whether it's seeing friends or participating in something that is really happy and meaningful, I often like to take photos because of the fact that, I could essentially look back. I dropped my phone, my apologies.
No problem.
I usually look back, to see some of the things. And at the end of the year, I often look back at the photos and go, wow, I couldn't believe that it was, last year or earlier in January where I caught up with, X, Y, and Z. So I have to say, if it weren't for, those moments during, with brain fog, I probably would not be capturing so much. But it's also those joyful moments that lead you to continue to push yourself to see more people, especially with the pandemic now. You don't get a chance to socialize with a lot of people. So those opportunities often remind me of like, oh yeah, wow, we have those. And besides, it's a good reminder to keep social and connected with friends. So
agreed. I could take a lot of lessons from that. I have a very bad, I don't take pictures. I'm very bad at like capturing the moment. And then I'm like, someone has a question about how was this trip or how did this go? Do you have pictures? And then I don't. So I think I could take a lot of lessons from that, just to kind of, even if it's one or two, because then, like you said, you have those memories to look back on and you realize, oh, you know what? Like there is a lot of people that I've spent time with, and it kind of gives you a little bit more of comfort knowing that there's a support system around you and there's a lot to look forward to moving forward too. So I think that's a great kind of lesson learned. Absolutely. Yeah. The toughest question I always ask folks on here, Gerald, is the final one. What are your top 3 fruits?
My goodness. Well, Alex, I used to buy lunch every day pre-pandemic, and that was because I could not cook. And that is still one of my weaknesses in life, as I am not good in the kitchen whatsoever. So to be honest, I actually don't eat enough fruits each day.
Right.
Family members and my girlfriend's parents, they would drop off fruits because they know I don't eat any. And I often just buy the frozen stuff, which sounds terrible. So long story short, I love watermelon in general because they're so easy, and cherries. I sound like an old person, but anything that's easy to chew and swallow in terms of fruits is probably, and seedless is probably my go-to. So watermelon, grapes, seedless, and maybe pineapples. I would have to say those are the tropical items. So
I love those. I think those are mine as well. Watermelon, grapes, and pineapple are actually my favorites. So we're clearly in the same boat on that. Great way to wrap up. We have a similar diagnosis time frame, and we wrapped it all up. It all comes full circle with fruit. So it's a
Well,
great way
thank
to
you
end.
for having me here this evening, Alex. I really appreciate it. So
No, and this is a great discussion, and I'm glad that we can kind of bring this to the forefront at We Get It. I'll let you get to your next stop on the subway there. Clearly getting off here, and we'll chat soon. But again, thank you, Gerald, for joining, and thank you everyone for listening, and we'll catch up next week.
thank you.
All right, take care.